market from an actual market perspective. And we have Terrence Flynn here, Managing Director of the research group for biopharma at Morgan Stanley. I'm gonna let Terrence open us up and introduce himself. But before I do, I just want to let everyone know we pre-recorded this session. The reason we did is you're watching it right now, right in the thick of earnings season, and so we were fortunate to get some of Terrence's time before that happened. So Terrence, please feel free to introduce yourself.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Mitch. Appreciate the invite to be here today. So yeah, as you mentioned, I work at Morgan Stanley and I am an equity research analyst. And so I am responsible for covering the biopharma sector here at Morgan Stanley. And so that involves me writing research and maintaining models for about 20 to 25 publicly traded companies in that sector, a number of which are working on new therapeutics for diabetes and obesity.
Oh,
and just from a disclosure standpoint, I just have to read my compliance disclosure. For important disclosures, please see the Morgan Stanley Research Disclosure website at www.morganstanley.com/research disclosures. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Great. Well, awesome. We're spend a few minutes today. I have 3 questions for you. Just really looking forward to your perspective. So I'll start it off just right off the bat. So, one of the things that I think we've heard kind of overarching and as a theme is supply. So, where do we stand from a GLP-1 supply standpoint, specifically Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, the 2 major manufacturers that we see in the market. And then also just kind of building on that, what about the status of reimbursement or insurance coverage as it relates to GLP-1s as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So look, I'll just remind everyone kind of what's going on here as everyone's, I'm sure, aware of the shortages in the marketplace. And so, these drugs, unlike a number of drugs, are delivered by an injection. So these are protein-based drugs. And so essentially, you need to manufacture the protein, the drug substance itself, but also then you need to put that into a device, which is then used to inject the drug into the body. And there are a limited amount of these fill finish facilities that are FDA inspected that can accomplish the sterile filling. And so that's really been the main bottleneck for scaling these new therapeutics. And so both Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk have been investing to build more of these facilities to accomplish that sterile fill finish aspect. And these facilities must be inspected and approved by the FDA. That obviously takes time, but there's a high amount of technical complexity that goes into building these, training the workforce, and ultimately getting FDA approval. And so that's been the main bottleneck. And so what I cover Eli Lilly. They've been focused on really investing a lot of money and time to bring these new facilities on board, especially in North Carolina. There's a couple new facilities they're working on there. The first one of those came on board summer of last year, and they have another one that's hopefully going to come on board here later this year or early next year. And so that's been one of the main bottlenecks. So Lilly, again, is investing in these new facilities, and we have some new research out on this, and that we're projecting that they're going to have about 195 million potential prescriptions by the end of the decade here, and that would be enough to serve about 16 million people with their injectable capacity.
Wow.
And just to frame it, currently we think there's about 6.5 million people on Lilly and Novo therapies. And again, the number I just gave you is a Lilly only number. So that's kind of the supply situation, Mitch. And I know that the second question you had related to kind of reimbursement dynamics. And obviously, that's always important with new medicines is, it's great to have medicines out there, but you also want to have the ability to access those medications through insurance coverage. And so as many people probably know, these medicines were originally approved for type 2 diabetes over a decade ago. And so the insurance coverage is very good for people that have type 2 diabetes. You're able to access them pretty seamlessly through your insurance company. Obesity, because it is a newer indication, only within the last couple of years or so, both companies have been working with insurance companies to build access. And so right now, from a Lilly perspective, they have about 2/3 of the people covered for obesity for their drug Zepbound. That number earlier this year was about only a third. So they've already made a significant step up in terms of coverage. There's also another piece where employers have to actually opt in on that coverage and decide to cover these medications for their employees. That step is also going well. We don't have as much visibility on that front, but there has been a lot of progress over the last 2 years to really improve insurance coverage. I'd say the other piece of it, which both companies are working on, is they're working to expand the indications that would be covered for this medication. So as I mentioned, type 2 diabetes is one of those indications.
Yeah.
Obesity is another indication. The companies are conducting studies in sleep apnea, as some people might have heard. They're looking at chronic kidney disease, heart failure. So there are a number of other indications. And really one of their aims is to broaden the insurance coverage through these other indications as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, well, this is pre-recorded. I will say that we're going to dive in a little bit to some of those and kind of look at what the expanded household penetration is of some of our panelists and exposure to some of those other, because it really, once we identify the ability for coverage, I think we've seen in our research that price is the leading indicator, both in what was going to stop someone from going on the medication, and then it's a main driver of lapsing and why someone stops. So it's just a really interesting dynamic there. Awesome.
Yeah, for sure. As I said, always important to have coverage for new medications. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So kind of building on that, there's this other headline around compound GLP-1. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So again, I'm sure people have seen the commercials on TV. It's hard to miss them, right? I mean, they've been all over. And so again, just some background here, because again, this is, the industry that I work in, a very heavily regulated industry by the FDA. But there are some situations where if a company is unable to supply the market, so there's a drug that's supply constrained, there is something that's called compounding that's allowed. And so the FDA will basically allow a compounded pharmacy to make a copy of that product available until the branded product becomes off the supply shortage, so it becomes more readily available. And so because of this tight supply situation we're in right now for some of these GLP-1 medications, these compounded pharmacies have stepped in to try to bring additional supply to the market. And so those are some of the commercials that you've seen. It is a little bit interesting, though, because as I said, the industry that I work in is very heavily regulated, but these compounding pharmacies are less regulated by the FDA. And so there have been some publications talking about some of the, purity of these products, et cetera. And so again, a lot of complexity here, but nonetheless, those are available. Some people have been accessing those. Mitch, I know you and your team have some data on that, which I'm sure people can access. But what Lilly has been trying to do is also, as we talked about earlier, improve the supply. So through those pen auto-injector devices, but they also announced a couple months ago that they were going to be making vials of the drugs Zepbound available. And so what that would require someone to do is then take a separate needle and put it into the vial, draw the drug up and inject themselves. So in contrast to an auto-injector device that's pre-filled, you just press a button, very easy to use. There is an extra step that's involved here. And so Lilly, in an attempt to improve supply, is going to make those vials available. And then as a result, the thought is that then the compounding pharmacies might have to stop making compounded product of the Lilly product because it would come off the shortage list. And again, I think there's some back and forth in terms of some of the legal steps here, but it's definitely a fluid situation. And so I'd say for now, these compounded products are available, but I think at least from a Lilly side, they are working as hard as they can to really ramp supply so that everyone can access an FDA-approved version of their product.
Wow, that is extremely interesting. Just to the point of the commercials, I think that's going to resonate with our entire audience here. We've all seen them, and what that actually means and why that is available today. That is fascinating.
But very dynamic situation. Again, I think it's something we're following closely, and again, it could change, over the near to medium term here.
Yeah, and I guess maybe my last question, building off of the injection, What's in the pipeline? Are there going to be oral GLP-1s anytime soon, or what's the market saying about that?
Yeah, no, a lot of focus here, obviously, from broad stakeholder base, because as we talk through, there's right now a finite amount of capacity that these companies can bring on board, and so in addition to trying to ramp the auto injector devices, a number of companies are working on potential oral pills that could deliver, maybe not the same level of weight loss, but maybe weight loss a little bit less than that what we see with the injectable products. And that could also be another way to help really scale the supply here of these medications. And so, for example, Eli Lilly has a product that's called orforglipron that is in late stage clinical development. So as some people might know, there's multiple stages of clinical development that you need to go through before you can get a drug approved by the FDA. They're in the last stage of this development right now, something called phase 3 development, and they're running very large studies in thousands of people. And if those data are positive, if they show a favorable risk benefit, they will then submit that application to the FDA, and then the FDA would approve that product. And so that's something that could potentially happen in a couple more years, and you'd have an oral formulation of a GLP-1 drug that could be on the market. And again, that would be less supply constrained than the injectable medications, because it uses different manufacturing technology in different facilities, which they're much more readily available. And so that's really one of the longer term keys here, in our view, to really scaling this, not just within the US, but also on a global basis. As you can imagine, that it's much easier to ship, these like small pills than it is to ship and manufacture these in auto injector devices. And so that's something that could not only, scale in the US, but also on a global basis.
Wow, that's just the growth of this and just kind of what we're seeing, and not even the impact on our consumer landscape, but just all those different processes that could lead to the future of this being really a consistent solution here for all of the ailments that it really helps out with. So, Terrence,
yeah, for sure. I think that's the goal, right? Is again longer term human health, and again trying to help along a number of different fronts. And again, I think this is one of those next frontiers.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Terrence, thank you so much for your time today and insight. It's been incredibly helpful. I have no doubt our audience really appreciated it.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Mitch. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks. All right. And we're back. Could you tell how much I was trying not to ask additional questions than what we had already talked about? Look, we were very fortunate to have Terrence and his insight and perspective on what was happening. And just, as we think about how that landscape is shifting, what it's going to mean for us on the consumer side, the retail side, and, there's a ton out there. So, with all that, we want to take you on where we think we're going to explore next. Some of this is really coming from a lot of what we have seen just in those four waves multiple waves that we have gone through, and see the changes, understanding the dynamics of the consumers. We're kind of getting this better understanding of where the opportunities come into place. And I think that's the big piece that is important for us to identify, is that it's no longer a risk, just the risk, I should say. There is opportunity out in the market, especially for those brands that are, in traditional retail environments. We're going to talk about consumption occasions and a number of different things. But these are the three pillars that I'll really talk about today. Household impact. What does having a user on a GLP-1, how does that look kind of difference between a one-person household, 2+? And then really, we're going to get outside of the grocery sector and talk a little bit more on LSR with limited service and fast food. Then we're going to talk about expanding consumer adoption. Katya really hit on some things that are barriers to entry. Insurance, cost, kind of one in those two things. We'll use one of our premium people groups of ailments to give you an understanding of potential market, or the market potential based on ailments, claimed ailments from our users, and then also what it looks like with current users and prospective users. And then last but not least, we're going to talk about innovating for brands against lapse behavior. This is one where we've learned a lot about what users are doing when they're on the medications. What happens when they come off? What are their intentions? How do they feel things are changing? And then ultimately, where do we think that's going to impact departments, grocery departments specifically, and how can brands think about that next phase of innovation? So let's kick it off real quick. As we think about these metrics are really focused on frequency. And I'm going to get to why I talk about frequency in a second, but we looked at the past 6-month frequency of our users that we know had claimed at least through the middle of the year. And so what you can see, and really what we're looking at, is those not using purchase frequency for grocery, which is anything grocery related sector anywhere, right? So that can include convenience, can include a grocery store, a club store. It's just any trip that has grocery on it. We actually see that those users, or non-users, are up 5.2% on a year-over-year basis, but GLP-1 users are only up 5%, a little bit of a shift there. Diabetes-specific users were up 7%, so there's some top line, but the weight loss only users, so I'm really gonna talk a lot about these weight loss only users, their trip frequency in the grocery sector is only up about 1.1%. And then you start to break that down on one-person households versus two-plus person households. You can see there's a little bit of a nuance there, where single-person households are actually up in their frequency in a grocery sector. Two-plus person households, not quite as much. The difference over on the side here is really the difference between those groups. So 1 versus 1 and 2+ versus 2+. So you can see how those 1+ households are really not keeping up at all with other 1+ households. But I think I'm going to get to why frequency in a second, but I just want to also hit on buy rate. So the 6-month buy rate, we are actually seeing that 1-person households have declined even more so than what those 2+ person households have. And so that really kind of shows that indication of what Katya was saying. There's some nuances in behavior between individual households that we can measure, kind of that individual consumption change, and then what happens to the overall landscape of the home. And that's really where we're going to bring in this idea of grocery versus LSR. Because what we started to see and understand was, hey, look, what happens between these cohorts, specifically in those 2+ households? If I'm having maybe more occasions that I'm consuming at home, I might actually be spending a little bit more than a single-person household because maybe I have a partner or kids or family members that are still in my home. And rather than go out to eat, maybe I'm bringing more occasions home, or maybe I'm spending things, buying things for them that those dollars would have ultimately gone somewhere else. And so you start to think about what that means in the environment. And so as we look to the LSR sector trips on the right-hand side, really what we see is that this is having a major impact. These 2+ households, GLP-1 using households, specifically for weight loss, are greatly under-indexed, are underperforming relative to non-users when it comes to LSR trips on a year-over-year basis. So what is LSR? For those of you not familiar, it's anything kind of fast food, it's fast casual dining. It does include things like banners like Chipotle or Starbucks or Panera, but also McDonald's and Taco Bell and Wendy's, Chick-fil-A. And so, we see this dynamic. And so when we talk about opportunities specifically for brands and retail, this is one of them in which, a GLP-1 user, yes, might reduce their consumption behavior, but there is very likely others in the house. The 2+ households is roughly 85 to 90% of the total user base. And you can see where you can actually acquire more trips and more consumption occasions as you think about what that means. And so, as we move on here, just to kind of overlay some impact of what it means, this right here is kind of where in the year-over-year trip basis for 2+ households, you're looking for non-users. But what happens when you bring in the weight loss users? Now, it's fascinating, to be honest. On the left-hand side, we have kind of the benchmark with the little hot dog thing, even though none of these places, I don't think, sell hot dogs, whatever. As we go through, though, McDonald's underperforming, Burger King underperforming, Taco Bell pretty significantly underperforming, Panera underperforming. Go all the way to the right when you see Starbucks. There's a pretty drastic underperformance on trips to Starbucks. Remember, this is trips specifically. So those with GLP-1 users. On the flip side, Chick-fil-A overperforming. Wendy's, Domino's, Chipotle. So there's indications and a very clear opportunity for us to potentially go out and survey these users and try to get more of an understanding more on the family dynamics. Why do you feel like you're going to Chick-fil-A more than what you had, and why would you be doing that? Are you ordering pizza more than what you had? Who's consuming if you're on a GLP-1 medication? So the whole point here is really that there is such a dynamic that it's not singular. It's not on that individual user. That household component is really having an impact. And we think it's an opportunistic impact for brands that may have some negative impacts on absolute consumption behavior, but it's also one that LSR and obviously with our receipt panel, we understand LSR behavior. There's clear potential here to understand more of what's going on and potentially have some positioning impacts as you go to market. Now look, next up, we're really going to start. Let's talk about what the expansion of consumers is going to look like. Now, as we look through, there's previous users here in lapsing, and so we have about 5.3% of the last update were lapsers. Now, really interesting to note, we're going to pull some of these syndicated data points out of our study that was launched about a year ago. We updated it in the summer. Again, we're not using everything from there. We have clients that have purchased and invested in a lot more detail of that report. But as we think about it, about 2/3 of weight loss users, about 2/3 of users using the GLP-1 for weight loss, they lapse before 6 months or within 6 months, excuse me. And so, think about what that means. There's a number of reasons why people lapse. It could be side effects. A lot of it is financial, honestly. And so as we think about what that is, but there's going to be a buildup of lapsed users over time. And what we really try to get an understanding of, are those lapsed users lapsers forever? Or is there something that might influence them to come back? And we can see that there is a fairly likelihood, or at least a majority likelihood, almost 60% on the left-hand side, of households that would be willing to come back. Again, insurance coverage, lower costs, those are two big drivers. The fourth there on the chart on the right, you see doctor recommendation or a different form. Terrence talked about that in our interview with him. That's a whole other world. And there's a lot of, if you follow the market, there's a lot of manufacturers that are in testing right now, just to see what that potential impact. So, our point here is, what does the future consumer base look like? And so, to get to this, we're really just kind of giving you an idea of what the potential is amongst our panelists here. And so, what we've done is we've taken our claimed ailments, which is our premium people group of ailments. It's our users indicating that there is at least an individual in the household that has an ailment here, themselves even specifically in some cases. And what we're trying to understand is, of those that have never used, and this is really a comparison of household penetration, even though we don't have the absolute values on here. This is a comparison of household penetration of never used GLP-1 in that teal colored bar. And then on the right side of each of those pieces, or each of those attributes, you have blue, which is currently using, and then red, which is aware would consider. And what we're really trying to kind of get this sense of is how many, or what is the equal opportunity. And so as we think about what is clear today, we have really three ailments that are cleared for GLP-1s. And again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not Terrence. There's probably a lot more detail into all of these, but as we think about it, obesity, hyperthyroidism is one, type 2 diabetes is one, and then heart disease being a big one as well. Those are three. What I think is really important to notice is that there are a number of other ailments that one could potentially say have some type of exposure because of their relationship to those three that are cleared. And so whether it be high blood pressure or high cholesterol, especially those with history of high cholesterol, family, the idea of what we think about here, like what a GLP-1 could do with more broader insurance coverage, there's so much more at stake than simply kind of what it has been talked about in the market from a weight loss management standpoint and diabetes specific standpoint. So those are really important things to think about, because there are going to be incremental users in the future that have different needs, and understanding kind of what the consumption behaviors, the household behaviors are now, that helps brands and retailers get ready for what moves out. And so that said, let's move on to our last piece and talk about innovation. Look, a lot of our data points were referenced in a recent Wall Street Journal article here on the left-hand side. And within that article, there was a quote from Jeff Tanner, who is the Simply Good Foods CEO. And Simply Good Foods is the company that owns the Atkins brand products. And you can see it here. I would say that I'm equally, if not more, excited about Atkins as an off-ramp for consumers who want to get off their drugs. It is, that is as clear as we're trying to convey. The timing couldn't have been better. Didn't obviously know that Mr. Tanner was going to say that. But as we think about what it means, the growing lapsed users in the space really provides an opportunity for brands to think about what it means. I've anecdotally shared with some of our partners, I was never on Atkins as a child, but my parents were, and understanding kind of their behaviors after they went off that program, with the intention of continuing the better for you lifestyle that they had worked so hard towards. It's what can help. What can brands do to help that, as Mr. Tanner puts, utilize that off ramp. And so, one of the things that we really looked at and asked some of our users, how are your perceptions of portion size, snacking, what your interest in certain foods, how are those feelings when you're on the medication versus off the medication? How are those changing? And so you can see here in this chart that really there's a lot in which people were pulling back on most behaviors. You can get on the bottom, you can see where current weight loss users of GLP-1 were thinking a little bit differently about how they utilize vitamins and nutrients. One thing that I will say is we see a lot of liquids and like protein shake growth when it comes to GLP-1 usage, but also just overall healthier eating habits. But then on the red, we think of those lapsed users. And so, they're starting to see that they have more cravings. The snacking occasions are coming back, but the intent to maintain the weight or to maintain the weight loss that they had, especially for those weight loss users, is crucial. It's the data across all kind of the entire landscape. We know that people gain back weight. The question is, how do you manage it? And so thinking about all those aspects are attitudinal, right? They're attitudinal, in which, again, why we do research with our panelists and understand some of these behaviors. But, to end it out, and I said we weren't going to talk a lot about products, I will end with a little bit of product. This is a 6-month grocery department buy rate change for all weight loss users versus all lapsed weight loss users. There is a comeback story, right? And this is, again, all users, so it includes those 1 and 2 plus households. There's a little bit of dynamic here where, yes, there's spending changes on a year-over-year basis. Those changes do happen. But thinking about where people are coming back, especially in those lapsed households, how to capitalize on those lapsed purchase behaviors, it's really a matter of not just asking GLP-1 users how they feel about things and how you can accommodate it, but it is all the individuals that are coming off. And I'll also say it's an important piece to note. Katya kind of mentioned it with the Whole Foods discussion. There's also a very clear intention with a number of consumers who may understand the value of the GLP-1, may have the kind of better for you lifestyle intent that they want. There's still opportunity to combine some of those areas of messaging with your products and with your innovation, in which you're talking to people that aren't even going to be using the medication. And so, as you think about this, think about your brand pipelines, your innovation pipelines, your messaging pipelines. This is really why you want to talk to your consumers, talk to the consumers that we know are on it, talk to the consumers that we know have lapsed. What does it mean for them to make these decisions and continue kind of this behavior, and do, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months from starting, how do they achieve success personally for them, and how can your brands line up for that? And so, as we look to close out, just the three main takeaways: a lot of shift in how we understand what the GLP-1 landscape looks like. It's, as Katya mentioned, younger, more affluent. We see massive growth within those, and that's really a product of availability through different channels. And look, if any of you watch TV at all, which I'm assuming the penetration of TV watchers on this call is probably pretty high, that there are a number of new brands that are showcasing these medications on a daily basis, sometimes multiple times during your favorite show. With that, thinking about how the top manufacturers in the industry, some of that commentary from Terrence, how have they worked through capacity issues? What does it look like moving forward? Where's innovation going to take GLP-1s next? From an injection to a pill form, what is that going to do for it? And then ultimately, as we think to the end, what is the impact on the household? How do you think about the broader impact on your business? How do you think about the fact that maybe some trips from LSR are shifting in home? LSR, if you're on the call, how do you think about capitalizing on that and making sure that you don't lose those trips? On top of that, it is also more people will eventually be covered under insurance. That's not an absolute statement. You just have to kind of look at the future and what GLP-1s have done already. And there's a growth cycle, and there's a lot of testing that's coming out in studies. So as you think about what that means, just assume that more are going to have access, because the barrier to entry is cost. And as cost in insurance coverage become less of a barrier, there's just going to be more people interested. And then, last but not least, as we think about just that last point overall, it's not just those users on it, but as Mr. Tanner mentioned, it's the off-ramp. What does the off-ramp look like? How can your brands position themselves for what a user is going to do after they're done? That's going to be likely going to be a much longer time frame and opportunity for brands and retailers as you think through. So that all said, thank you all very much for joining us. I didn't say at the top of the call, and I'm really sorry that we weren't going to take questions, just given to the specificity of some of the questions. But if you want to submit your questions, please go ahead and email us at hello@numerator.com. We appreciate your time. And look, if you haven't already signed up for Topical Twists, please do so. That's going to be an absolutely awesome presentation, as it was earlier this year. So, again, thank you for your time, and we hope you found the information informative. Look forward to hearing from you.